Today's webinar is the survivors of financial abuse, and with me in the room I have Sandra Sankey from the Improvement Service. I have Karen Nayland sitting here as well from Wesleyan Citizens Advice Bureau, and I have Joanna McLaughlin, I can't say that, sorry, my dear colleague who I normally sit next to as well, who works for our Tackling Violence Against Women network. With us from London we have Nicola Sharp-Jeffs, who is on mute as well right now, so sorry about it. I'm handling too many things here in one go, but I think we'll get started now. So Sandra, do you want to do the introductions here, and I'll do the start here, and I'll just hand over to you.
Thank you, Christopher. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sandra Sankey. I'm the project manager. Sorry, I've got a problem with my sound. Bear with me. Right. Okay. Show my screen.
Yeah, Sandra, if you just take your headphones out, then you wouldn't have double sound.
Okay, apologies everyone. Bear with me. This sound on.
No.
Okay.
Just speak.
Okay, good morning everyone. I'm Sandra Sankey. I'm the project manager at the Improvement Service on the Improving Outcomes in Money Advice project, and I've coordinated the webinar session today. Thank you so much for bearing with us on that rocky start. I hope you're going to enjoy the session today. We've got great participation with over 70 attendees registered to join in. It's quite a diverse audience, majority coming from a local authority background, citizens advice bureaus, housing, health, wider third sector organisations, a mix of national body representatives and others. Okay, this is how the webinar will run today. I'm just going to kick it off and then followed by the other key speakers, and Christopher's already given us the introduction, and when we come to the end we'll then have the question and answer session. So I mentioned earlier the Money Advice Outcomes project. I've been working on this project for a few years now, since we carried out initial research before moving into the improvement phase. The project is actually funded through the UK Money Advice Service and the Improvement Service, and we have a partnership agreement to deliver services. I've highlighted on this slide a couple of the main services that we provide on the project, and the slide does include some hyperlinks that can take you into our web pages, and you can see all the diverse range of work that we deliver and a number of publications that we have produced so far already, and more to come. So please feel free afterwards to take more time to have a browse around that. If you wish to know more information on anything, then please just get in touch afterwards. One of my work streams this year involved early interventions for improving access to advice services and trying to identify where some of the challenges and barriers existed for this. I've got a lot of experience in the sector and know what difficulties people can face when impacted by domestic abuse, and the amount of hidden abuse and the financial related impacts. It was through my close working with my colleague Jo, who's going to be speaking later, and her Tackling Violence Against Women and Girls team that the conversation started to develop. We started to look more closely at the connections between the teams and the opportunity to collaborate. I attended the National Tackling Violence Against Women and Girls conference last year, which was fantastic, and then it led on to myself coordinating, in collaboration with others, a stakeholder event during 16 Days of Action. That was in November last year. So from that, we've started to share more in-depth information around this subject matter and discuss how we can collaborate across both our networks, taking some issues forward. the 16 Days of Action event, that brought a real mix of people together across both the networks at a local and national policy level, senior management as well as frontline staff delivering on projects. It involved a number of local authorities, third sector, domestic abuse agencies, health, DWP, social security, police and fire services. A mix of presentations were delivered on the day, and the key topics that we had in our group discussions involved looking at what early intervention approaches exist in local areas with agencies at the moment between the sector. Looking at the partnership working across the domestic abuse and the advice services, what training currently exists, whether people deliver it or whether they attend training, and areas that could perhaps be strengthened. And also we learned about where routine inquiry around domestic abuse and financial inclusion matters are being asked at the moment in particular sectors, and again having a think about where that could be applied in each individual's organisation and what improvements we could take on that going forward. So there will be, all that material is available on the website just now, and there is a summary report from the outcomes from that event and the group discussions which you can download, and there will be some further learning points to be uploaded to the website in due course. Some stakeholders have since gone on to look at how they can work together and strengthen their partnership working, both at a local level and national level, and this is really, really positive. This has been fed back to me since we delivered the event last year. Police Scotland is just one example. They've given a statement which I've published in the summary report, which is about their response in dealing with domestic abuse and how the financial abuse is identified as part of the process and the linkages that the Police Scotland are trying to make at a local level with advice services to address people's needs. So the other thing that I really wanted to highlight was the Money Advice Service evaluation report that was recently published around reaching marginalised groups. That is a really, really useful guidance document, and it's for funders and providers of debt advice. You're going to be hearing from Karen later, who's actually been involved with delivering one of the projects that was funded. But if you haven't seen that report, I would please urge you to have a look at it. It outlines the delivery models which are being used to deliver debt advice to clients within a complex set of needs in Scotland. Some of those models include people experiencing domestic abuse. The projects were pilot projects to test what works. The evaluation has a whole range of key learning points, as I've mentioned earlier, for advice providers as well as funders. One of those particular key learning points is about the models of advice services. So the learning point for advice providers was about exploring options for formalising those relationships with a mainstream provider to access training and provide peer support. And then another example for that one for funders is that debt advice activity should be contextualised into the broader purpose for the organisation to actively reach out and cultivate a relationship of trust with vulnerable groups. So that's just to give you an example. You'll hear more about this as we go on. So just to finish off, I'm asking you all today to please continue to knowledge share on this agenda. It's a very, very important subject matter. Share the links to any published material that's useful for you around your wider networks. Have a look at your own partnership working, your own training opportunities or training that you delivered and how that could be improved to take in some of the wider learning that you'll take from today. And look at your training, any opportunity as well to contribute to the development of your local gender-based violence strategy and action plans, as well as align with any other strategic priorities. So I think that's going to bring me to the end. I'm going to pass you over to Nicola now, who's going to talk about her research. And thank you all again for being with us at the start, and thank you very much for listening.
Just a couple of questions, Sandra. Will we be able to share slides from today?
Yes, we'll be able to share slides from today.
And the next question, there was another question right now. Sorry, it's not. But the website you refer to, that's the improvement service, improving outcomes in money advice, where the case studies are to be found. Thank you very much. I will hand over to Nicola, and we'll just. There might be a doubling of sound here for a moment, but please feel free to So Nicola, can you hear us?
I can. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
Great stuff. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Sandra, who really is leading the way in terms of getting this issue out there in Scotland. So I really appreciate being involved in that. I've been asked to talk a little bit about some research around financial abuse, focusing particularly on early intervention, which I'll do. And then I'm going to move on a little bit to talk about the role of the charity which I've founded, called Surviving Economic Abuse. So I'm going to start with the elephant in the room in the terms of our terminology around economic abuse and financial abuse. Obviously, we're talking about financial abuse here today, but the charity that I work for talks about economic abuse. So just to say that those terms are often used interchangeably, but financial abuse is actually a subcategory of economic abuse. So when we're talking about financial abuse, we're generally talking about money and access to finances, but perpetrators of domestic violence will very often also control access to economic resources more broadly. So here I'm talking about things like access perhaps to transportation, perhaps to your own car, perpetrators who might throw a partner out of their own home when they have an argument, so the use of economic resources in that way. Very taken by an example that Amber Rudd showed on BBC One show last week, where they talked about how a woman had to ask the perpetrator every time she went into the fridge to get food. So when we're talking about economic abuse, we're talking about the things that money can buy more broadly. So this is the definition of financial abuse which I use. It is adapted from Adrian Adams' definition, which she developed with colleagues around economic abuse specifically. But I talk about financial abuse involving an individual interfering with their partner's ability to acquire, use and maintain economic resources. And when we talk about an individual interfering, that can be through either control, exploitation and or sabotage. So why do we need to address it? Well, I've just pulled out a few statistics here which I think are very powerful in terms of making us aware of the importance of this issue within the context of coercive control more broadly. So women are 3.5 times more likely to be subject to domestic violence if they find it impossible to find £100 at short notice. So issues around financial vulnerability can actually make people more vulnerable to experiencing physical abuse. And the risk of experiencing physical abuse among those who experience economic abuse is actually nearly 5 times greater than those who don't. So there's a real link and association between these two forms of abuse. It's very, very rarely that you will find financial abuse operating on its own when we're talking about it within the context of domestic violence. Economic barriers, as I'm sure many people are aware, can result in women staying with abusive men for longer than they want to and experiencing more harm as a result. So again, a lot of the women that I've spoken to, especially those who have children and want to maintain a certain standard of living and comfortableness for their children, talk very much about how they're constantly balancing the physical, sexual, emotional abuse they might be experiencing against the economic harm in terms of leaving. And as we know, women generally experience a decline in their financial well-being after separation, and obviously there are issues particular to lone parents who might then also experience financial abuse post-separation. And that really feeds into the last point around how lack of economic security and access to resources post-separation are the primary reason why a lot of women do return to an abusive partner. So I suppose when we're thinking about that question of why doesn't she or why doesn't he leave, access to financial resources are key. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about some research which I undertook on behalf of the Cooperative Bank and Refuge, which sought to understand how prevalent financial abuse actually is. The Office of the National Statistics doesn't actually publish any particular statistics around financial abuse. This won't be relevant to those listening in Scotland, but the Crime Survey for England and Wales does ask a question about financial abuse, but the ONS, Office for National Statistics, doesn't report on it separately. So we don't really have any knowledge about the prevalence of financial abuse from official channels. However, the idea behind the Cooperative Bank and the Refuge research was to get a sense of how prevalent financial abuse is across the UK. So we are talking about England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And what we found was that 1 in 5 British adults reported having experienced financial abuse in a current or past relationship. And what I really need to stress in relation to this finding is that this is self-reported. So participants were given the definition of financial abuse, which I shared with you a few minutes earlier, and we asked whether that was something that they had experienced, and they said yes or no. And what we found was that 1 in 5 women experienced financial abuse and 1 in 7 men experienced financial abuse within that overarching statistic. So women slightly more likely to experience financial abuse than men. And we found some really interesting differences in relation to that experience when we looked at gender. So women were more likely to report experiencing financial abuse across all forms or all forms of interference, so control, exploitation and sabotage. They were more likely to experience other forms of abuse, so alongside financial abuse within the context of coercive control, so the physical, sexual, emotional abuse. Nearly 8 in 10 women experienced financial abuse for more than 5 years. And I think this is a really powerful statistic and goes back to what I was saying about this balancing of harm and how a lot of women that I've spoken to think long and hard about leaving because of the financial difficulties that they are likely to experience following separation. But, and again, this will go back to this question, as I said, about why doesn't someone just leave? 1 in 4 women will also experience financial abuse post-separation. So just because you leave doesn't mean that this problem goes away. And that's very much the nature of coercive control. There should be a slide here in relation to men. I'm so sorry, it doesn't seem to be there. But just from memory, just to say that men were more likely to experience financial abuse in relation to exploitation. They were slightly less likely to experience other forms of abuse within that same context. And the very vast majority experienced a single incidence of exploitation, which lasted for less than 6 months. So we can see here that there's a real difference, a real gender difference in terms of the experience of financial abuse. But what I would caveat that by saying is that looking at men and women's intersectional locations, so also looking at gender and how that interacts with things like sexuality, disability, ethnicity, do create a more complex scenario or a complex picture. So we can't be just sort of as black or as white as this difference between the genders. So I just wanted to say a little bit about post-separation then, because I've done a piece of work which looked at homicide reviews. And the significant thing about financial abuse is that it doesn't require physical proximity in the same way that physical abuse does. So quite often, if it hasn't begun within the context of the relationship, it may actually start post-separation, or if it already exists, it will continue or escalate. And Websdale, who is a leading authority in relation to homicide in the States, says that when women experience economic abuse and financial abuse within a context of coercive control, then they are at increased risk of domestic homicide. So this is another reason why financial abuse and our focus on it is so important. And the research that I did found that a number of domestic homicide reviews featured financial abuse, including financial issues as well, so linked issues such as rent arrears. I sit on the quality assurance panel at the Home Office, which looks at the homicide reviews produced by local authorities in England and Wales. And increasingly, we're seeing examples of financial abuse within them. So if for no other reason, a reason to be interested and to put some time and energy into looking at this issue is that, you know, it really does sometimes, it could indicate the matter between life or death. So there's my slide on men and financial abuse. So just talking about early intervention then, because this is a focus very much of Sandra's work in Scotland. So the same study found that over a third of those who said that they had experienced financial abuse said that they had told no one about it. So obviously that's a lot of people who were suffering in silence. And really interestingly, again, more women reported not telling anyone about financial abuse compared to men. And my interpretation of that, although we would need to explore this in more research, is that if you're experiencing it within a context of coercive control, then actually speaking out and perhaps challenging that is more dangerous, as the domestic homicide reviews would seem to indicate. But what is interesting is who those who do tell someone about financial abuse disclose to. And quite consistent with domestic violence research more broadly, victims are more likely to tell a friend or a family member if they are experiencing any form of abuse. But particularly significant here is that in relation to financial abuse, this is then followed by a bank or a debt company. So it does seem that when they have to, victims will disclose to someone who might be supporting them around their financial well-being. So I just also wanted to talk a little bit about some barriers to disclosure, because this will be relevant if you're working with somebody who you suspect might be experiencing financial abuse but who hasn't disclosed that. Firstly, a lot of people don't recognise their experience as financial abuse. Again, it's one of these issues that we don't really talk about, and perhaps there's less understanding. Again, domestic abuse tends to be associated with physical abuse. So not being aware that you might be experiencing financial abuse would obviously be a reason why you wouldn't disclose it. Through interviews, I've spoken to women who've talked about feeling stupid, embarrassed and humiliated when they feel like they have experienced financial abuse and they're disclosing that to someone. They can't believe that they hadn't realised that at the time, and they feel that they will be judged. So there's issues here around non-judgmental responses. And also through interviews, people have talked about kind of like a double bind, in the sense that domestic abuse is a very private issue, which as a society we don't tend to talk about. Similarly, money is also quite often seen as a private matter. So when you put together financial abuse as an element of domestic violence, which does involve money, that can act as a double barrier for people to talk about it. Again, women have talked about being concerned about a damage to their financial reputation and standing. So to disclose to someone that that's happened to them might make it look as if they're not very financially capable, which is not necessarily going to be the case, but they'll feel that because of what's happened to them, that's what it will look like to an outsider. They fear not being believed. And as I previously talked about, they might feel fearful of a partner's response if they were to disclose, if they're still within the relationship. So just very quickly to talk a little bit about surviving economic abuse. We were set up for some of the reasons that I've already highlighted, that we really need to raise awareness of this form of abuse, but also build the capacity of those who come into contact with victims and survivors to be able to respond. And we've done some work in relation to that, and that has included very kindly being invited to Glasgow in November by Sandra to speak at and participate in the event that she spoke to you about within her presentation. And I really would urge you to read a summary of that conference if you are unable to attend, because it really was a very valuable conference. So just talking a little bit about building capacity here. Quite often we find that people might have training in domestic abuse broadly, but that there's been no specific focus on financial or economic abuse. So that's something that we're offering to people who are interested in doing it. And we also work to address some of the systems issues, because there's also only so far that those of us working on the ground can go in terms of the support we provide to our clients when we come up against systems issues. So for example, an SNP MP very recently highlighted in the House of Commons an issue where a bank was refusing to close a joint bank account without the permission of the perpetrator, and the MP in question, Philippa Gregory, was seeking to raise awareness of this through the Prime Minister's question, because her constituent member had experienced domestic violence and rape, and the perpetrator was able to exercise ongoing control through the systems that existed within her bank. So I just wanted to flag to you that another piece of work that we're doing is working with UK Finance, which used to be the British Bankers Association, and we're also working with Lloyds Banking Group, and they are both looking at the development of an industry standard which would set out as routine how banks and building societies should respond to this issue. So very key to all of this is the importance of training. We often say that domestic abuse is hidden in plain sight, If we're not aware of it and the dynamics, it can be very hard to see, but actually when we are aware of those things, then quite often these things jump out at us. So it is really very important. That's telling me that my 15 minutes is up. That was my alarm. It's very important that we do train people in recognising this issue. And of particular importance in relation to this is that survivors and victims of domestic abuse need both practical and safety addressed within their experience. So if you're within a generic service providing money advice and you're not aware that someone might have experienced domestic abuse, or if you are but are not perhaps aware of some of the particular safety needs, it is the case, unfortunately, that inadvertently you might increase the risk that that individual might be at in terms of their risk of, well, ultimately homicide. So it's really important to be able to respond to both the context and complexity of victims' lives. And I'll just end by referring back to the evaluation again that Sandra spoke about and urged you to read at the beginning of this webinar, which talks about how services in Scotland are working together to address the issue. And I'm really delighted to hear that as a consequence of that seminar, Sandra, more people are doing this integrated and joint working because it really is vitally important. So just to end by saying that I think, again, similarly, and in the feeling of today, it is really important that we are learning from each other. And so here's a link here to a national, or an international, sorry, I should say, network of interested individuals. So we have over 100 people sharing information around financial abuse. So that's research, practice, policy in over 7 countries now. And if you're interested in this issue and learning from international practice, then I would urge you to join. And you can do that via our website, or you can drop me an email. My details are here. Or similarly, you can contact me via Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola. We just needed to unmute us here at our end. And we're now getting ready. Sorry, we had another microphone problem in this little room we're sitting in. We're now passing on to Karen, who's doing her first webinar and is slightly nervous, especially with the technical issues we've had, but I think everything is going to be okay. Karen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes,
while we
good morning, everyone. This is an example of when technology goes wrong. But we're getting there because Christopher's doing a wonderful job looking after us. So we're just pulling up the slides just now. I'd like to thank Sandra for her invitation to talk about our project this morning. We deliver in partnership with West Lothian's Women's Aid a joint project, and we deliver the advice element of this project. So originally the project is funded. The funding actually came from the Money Advice Service. Sandra spoke earlier about pilot projects, and this money came through the Scottish Legal Aid Board. And as I said before, we work in close partnership with West Lothian's Women's Aid to deliver this service to individuals. And our service is open to both male and female, females who have experienced domestic abuse. And we have been running the project since 2013. So the project was initially set up, and it's been designed, as a partnership project due to the complex nature of the client's problems, but also to recognise there was a vulnerability within the client group, and quite often that meant that their emotional well-being and they found it difficult to cope. So the purpose of the partnership working was that the CAB are experts in advice, and of course West Lothian's Women's Aid and other Women's Aid offices are experts in domestic abuse. So our original aims of the project was to ensure that we provided advice and information at the correct time, with a key focus on money advice in order to improve the client's circumstances and of course their situation, because quite often when they're engaging with the service, finance is a huge issue for them, particularly if they're in refuge. and the client's been referred to us, so they've had quite a massive change in circumstances. So of course the financial aspect is is a key concern for them, as well as the financial aspect. The holistic service that the CEB are able to provide is hugely beneficial for the clients, meaning that they get this holistic service and advice and information. So we hope and we work with Women's Aid to ensure that the advice services that's provided to the clients, we've got an aim that they stay free from abuse, and of course that they are in more stable circumstances. So through the advice and information, what we're trying to do is to provide them more stability, and and to build their confidence, to give them courage and the strength not to go back to the abusive situations. And I think in relation to the clients that we're dealing with through this project, their needs are very complex, and quite often we're working with them over a prolonged period of time. So they may be, another positive for this project is that we co-locate with West Lothian's Women's Aid, and we deliver from their offices, and there's also 2 refuge in West Lothian, and we spend a week, we have a weekly presence in there also. So what we're trying to do is create an environment where these women feel safe, and it's an environment that is more familiar to them rather than the CAB offices. So the different types of advice and information that we offer, I've spoken about the holistic service, but there is obviously some key areas of advice, and that's obviously housing options. Quite often that's quite a priority for them, and we've been developing stronger working relationships with housing staff and West Lothian Council, and of course West Lothian Women's Aid. I've got good links with the housing as well. Debt and money advice. To begin with, the debt and money advice aspect is not always a priority for our clients engaging, because there is just too much going on for them to be able to cope with that situation. So we find that comes much later on through the advice process. But certainly the financial capability work to what we do, and the budgeting, that's, it's quite important we do that quite early on. Quite often they've not had control of their budget or money, so therefore, that might be new to them, and obviously there's different service charge and things like that to pay in Women's Aid. So it's quite important that we equip them with those tools. We've got, obviously there's the legal and family issues that come out through the project as well, and I'll speak about that in the final slide a wee bit more in terms of the learning, because that's something that we have learned and that we're acting upon. And of course there's the element of benefit appeals and any tribunal representation. So it's the whole holistic service that we offer the clients. In terms of the referral criteria, then clients can be referred through the CEB ourselves, and West Lothian Women's Aid, and there's another organisation within West Lothian called the Domestic Abuse and Sexual Assault Team in West Lothian, who also make referrals to the project. We've also had referrals from GPs. We have a regular weekly presence in GP surgeries, so we've had quite a few referrals from GPs where the client has reported a domestic abuse situation. We've got close working relationships with the police, the domestic abuse unit, who also know and refer into the project, and other organisations like social work. And of course, there's always the option for clients to self-refer into the project. So just come to some of the key stages of the project before I finish on some of the learning. So in terms of the referral and partnership working have been key for us, because whilst we knew about West Lothian Women's Aid and they knew about CAB, we definitely didn't work in close partnership. So we feel that through this project we've been able to develop a closer partnership. We book appointments for clients, for the holistic service in areas that they feel comfortable with. And of course, the advice worker's role is to provide the advice, information and advocacy. And, I've just noted about the importance of key roles there, because for us that was something that we worked with Women's Aid to establish quite early on, because our advice workers to a certain extent were the advisors, but of course the support workers at Women's Aid had more of the domestic abuse, so it was working to establish the clear roles so that we would work together rather than duplicating the work. Just about some of the key learning points I would like to highlight before I finish, because I have to say from a lot of I've probably learned the most as a manager delivering on this project than what I have with than other projects in the Bureau. And the key to success in the delivery of this project in order for us to engage with our client group was definitely about the partnership working. Was to deliver that in partnership and learn from each of the organisations. And sorry, I'd just like to bring co-location up for that as well, because we very much co-locate for this project and we don't rely on the clients coming to us. We very much go to the clients in an environment where they feel safe. So I've mentioned before that can be Women's Aid offices, the refuge, but we've also seen in GP surgeries as well. Financial capability work I mentioned, that's really key and really important for the project. We do a lot of work in terms of financial capability. We've done one-to-one financial capability, but we've also done financial capability workshops also. The joint training events, there was very little training specifically, in West Lothian, although DASAT do, a great job in some of the training events, but there was definitely a gap there. So we, as part of the project, host an annual training event. And that's fabulous for networking as well. So that's always really popular. In terms of the barriers, to a certain extent there is still barriers to access to the service, just because we are just one project trying to deliver across quite a large geographical area. Just about policies as well, the need, some of the learning was about the need to have really robust, clear policies. Just in particular, we to go back and relook at was about the child and adult protection policies. So whilst we did have them, they weren't really fit for the purpose for this project. So we were able to review them and make them fit for the purpose. In terms of just about gaps and about the future of the service, for us, we identified a gap in terms of the legal advice and assistance for the project, because they were getting the holistic advice service from CEB. They were getting emotional support either from Women's Aid or DASAT, but there was a gap in terms of the legal advice, and our clients were continuously telling us that they found access to legal advice and assistance for a whole range of reasons quite difficult in West Lothian. So we've been able to look at that, and we're looking to continue this project, but adding on legal advice and assistance, and that means that the client would get the whole holistic service, and hopefully with AMA always remain free of domestic abuse. So I think that's all I've got to say. I think I've run out of time this morning. The slides, as Christopher said, will be shared, and obviously if anybody, my contact details are on the slides as well, so if anybody wants to make direct contact in relation to any aspect of what I've said, then please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That's really enlightening presentations there. I'm now going to pass you over to our final speaker for today, and it's my good colleague Jo, who's the National Violence Against Women Coordinator. Over to you, Jo. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. So this webinar today was obviously organised by the Money Advice team, but links in very closely to the ISE's work within our Violence Against Women programme. And looking through the attendee list, I'm aware that there are a lot of people here from multi-agency Violence Against Women partnerships who will be aware of the ISE's work within this. But for those that aren't, the Improvement Service coordinates the National Violence Against Women Network, which brings together representatives from local multi-agency violence against women partnerships across the country to share information, learning and resources, and really to make sure that all partners have the capacity and capability to implement the ambitions set out in Equally Safe at a local level. We do this in a number of ways. So the network meets 6 times a year face-to-face, bringing together representatives from partnerships along with national stakeholders. And we also have a K-Hub group where members are able to connect to each other on an ongoing basis and share information. And I think over the last year, it's fair to say that the Money Advice team and the Violence Against Women team within the IS have been working much more collaboratively together in recognition that there is a real crossover between the needs to tackle economic abuse and financial abuse and looking at the duties and responsibilities of multi-agency violence against women partnerships to ensure that a coordinated and strategic response is taken to eradicating all forms of violence against women and girls at a local level. And as we're getting ready to put together our work plan for the coming 12 months, there's definitely opportunities to be collaborating more closely on this agenda, whether it's running more webinar or training series, looking at briefings for elected members to highlight good practice and look at what role they can be doing to ensure that economic abuse is tackled at a local level. And just looking at how we can strengthen partnership working and make sure that a joined up approach is taken to tackling economic abuse at a local level. That worked well. And I just wanted to finish by touching on some of the opportunities and drivers at a local and national level. So obviously the main one within the Violence Against Women agenda is Equally Safe, which is Scotland's strategy for preventing and eradicating violence against women and girls. And the delivery plan for this was published by COSLA and the Scottish Government in November of last year. And it highlighted a couple of upcoming pieces of work or developments which might be interesting for this agenda. So the first of them is that COSLA is in the process of recruiting an Equally Safe capacity and capability coordinator. And one of their roles will be undertaking a mapping exercise to look at the capacity and capability of statutory partners across the country to ensure that they're able to respond, identify and respond to all forms of violence against women in an effective way. So I think there's a real opportunity to make sure that looking at economic and financial abuse is part of that work and looking at the roles that public sector partners within health, advice, housing, whatever it is, have the skills and knowledge to be identifying economic abuse as well as other forms of abuse. And then I suppose another key one is the scoping work that Scottish Women's Aid's currently going to be doing, again looking at capacity and capability in the sector to implement Equally Safe, looking at in particular where there's gaps in training and knowledge that a more coordinated and sustainable approach is needed to tackling them. And then finally, I suppose a key driver at the moment is the Domestic Abuse Scotland Bill, which has just been passed and is due to achieve royal assent early next year. But it's really, I suppose, created more of an emphasis on the recognition that coercive control and economic abuse is a fundamental part of domestic abuse, and really raised awareness of the harms that these causes and ensuring that a more holistic approach is needed to responding to them. And I think that's really all I want to say. I've just put my contact details at the end of the slide as well, and on the Improvement Service website there's also a section for the Violence Against Women Network where we've got a series of elected member briefings, information about our conference and links to local multi-agency violence against women partnerships for anyone who isn't familiar with them.
Okay, thank you very much, Jo. Thank you to Nicola, Can and Jo and for Christopher as well for facilitating the webinar today. That's given us lots of useful information, lots of food for thought, lots to think about. We've made ourselves available for any contact afterwards. We will send out a brief survey and ask a couple of questions just to gather in a wee bit more feedback from the network and the attendees today. So I'd be very grateful if you'll reply to that. I'm going to hand over to Christopher now. This is a good opportunity for you all to ask questions now for all the panellists, and hopefully we'll be able to respond to them all for you. So we've got a bit of time left, so I'll hand over to yourself, Christopher, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. I can see there are a couple of raised hands. It is better if you use the question pane below to ask your questions, and then I have a chance to pass them on to the panelists. We have a couple of questions, and Karen, you seem to be the favorite victim right now. So the first question, will the Women's Aid Citizens Advice Bureau project be ongoing, or is it funding dependent?
It's funding dependent, unfortunately, like most really fabulous projects. We do have an end date, but we're working really hard with our partners, and we've actually, I don't want to jinx us, but we're waiting on a funding decision coming off with a couple of funders who recognise, the need for this project and are really very keen. So whilst, our current project is due to end at the end of this month, there's a real positive indication that may continue.
Thank you very much. Another question for you, Karen. It's great to hear your experience. Can you comment on how important or otherwise you feel it is for clients of this project to see the same Citizens Advice Bureau worker each time?
Well, I actually have a job share position, so there's two members of staff that deliver on this. But yeah, I do agree with that consistency for this client group is really important, because it takes the clients quite a long time to gain somebody's trust. So I suppose that was another learning for us, as well as to be consistent in terms of the advisor. I mean, it's just paid advisors that deliver on that project anyway. At this present time we don't have volunteers delivering on it. So yeah, it's about the ongoing relationship is very important. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. So I don't know exactly who this is for. In Glasgow, the development of a series of routine and sensitive inquiry questions for money advice workers has been identified as a priority for inclusion in our citywide strategic plan. Would there be an interest to help develop this as a tool for use nationally? I don't know if that's for you, Sandra, or possibly for Nicola.
I can comment on that, certainly. I think that would be certainly very, very useful. From what we heard, Nicola shared a little bit of learning as well. There is a lot of work going on around this in England and Wales that I think, we need to learn a bit more from, and how we could apply that in Scotland. And the stakeholder event that we had in November that I referred to earlier, we certainly had a very fruitful discussion around that, and there was definitely an appetite to look at what else, not just advisors on the front line, but obviously other people as well, but my focus mainly looking at advisors on the front line. What else do people need in their toolkit around this issue, and how can we strengthen that? So absolutely, anything that we can build on. We've got a remit within the project to look at how we can share that knowledge wider and build on it. And if we can do that in collaboration, then that's a great opportunity.
Nicola?
I would just echo what Sandra said. I'm hearing about some great practice across the UK, and it would just be fantastic to make sure that's all coordinated and that we're learning from each other and maximising the opportunity to support survivors and victims.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I have to unmute Nicola and unmute ourselves to not create too many sound trouble here. So there's another question for Karen. I'm interested in the child and adult protection policies. Sorry, now I got cut off. It got cut off here. Do you want to say anything about the adult and child protection policies?
Well, only that we did have these policies in place as a CEB. However, there was, as you could imagine, some child and adult protection issues came up through the delivery of the project, and I quickly realised that they actually weren't fit for the purpose. So we had to update them. So I don't know who's asking the question, but if you want to contact with me, I'm happy to share or happy to discuss it further.
We have the name of the person asking the question here. I'm choosing not to share so everybody can ask freely, and we can follow up with any individuals afterwards. A question for Sandra or maybe for Joe. Hello, does the Improvement Service currently have partnerships with any banks in Scotland with the aim of training staff in how to recognise financial abuse and also support and signpost women who might report financial abuse? Is that you, Joe?
I'm not aware of any relationships the Improvement Service has. Within local violence against women partnerships, again, I'm not aware of them being partners, but I'm sure that some will have relationships or discussions with local businesses at a local level, as well as statutory partners. It's not something we've looked at before, but potentially it's an area that we could investigate more. Sandra, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the Improvement Service having any partnerships with banks. I'm certainly aware of the financial industry engaging in particular forums, with the money advice sector, and that's, there's a particular forum called the Money Advice Liaison Group, which is a forum between advice professionals and financial sector, creditor sector. And there's also representatives from the finance industry on the Scotland Financial Capability Steering Group. There is various forms of partnerships, with banks, but it is potentially something wider to explore. With certainly all the work that's going on at a national level that Nicola referred to earlier and the codes of practice.
Yeah, Nicola, I'm just going to ask you as well, because you said large banking group and they're obviously big in Scotland as well. Do you have anything to add to this?
Just to say that I know Nationwide Building Society is exploring this issue also, as is the Cooperative Bank as well. So I am not aware of what's going on at the local level, but I know nationally everyone is very engaged. And I think the useful thing about the UK Finance Code of Conduct will be just that consistency for survivors who sometimes will actually be fleeing across national borders. So it would be fantastic if they can have a consistent response in banks and building societies wherever they live in the UK.
Thank you very much. So we have another question in, I think this is probably for Nicola, but maybe you want to add to it here as well from this place, from the Improvement Service. For ethnic minority women who face financial abuse, is there any focused work on being done to address the language, culture and religious barriers they face in being able to access mainstream services? Also, with regard to partnership working, has any partnerships been done with ethnic minority organizations who work with ethnic minority women? So we'll start here and then maybe pass on to Nicola as well. Do you have anything on this, Joe?
Again, I know within local multi-agency violence against women partnerships, most do have BME organisations feeding into them who have a role to play, whether it's doing needs assessments and making sure that the particular issues that survivors from BME backgrounds are met and responded to at a local level. There's also been a role in recent years about making sure that there's resources available in a range of languages if that's needed, with more people coming through to the country.
And I'll have something,
it's just that we did through for a project delivery point of view. I'm quite lucky actually that we have a lot of expertise within the team. Advice team and on the issues, but also we did identify it as a training need, and it was about the cultural differences in domestic abuse, and that was actually one of the one of our training days. We had a focus on that. So for a project delivery point of view, then we did address some of the training needs that we had in relation to that. So yeah,
I'll open up for Nicola. Nicola, do you have anything on this subject?
Yeah, so just to say from a research perspective, it's an area that we need to understand a lot more about. And there is an academic at Sheffield Hallam University called Punita Chowbey, who has looked specifically at the experience of South Asian women who experience financial abuse. And also talking to stakeholders, we're aware of particular forms that financial abuse might take for members of some communities. So things like dowry abuse, for example, pressure on some family members to send money back home, etc. So it's something that we really need to be addressing. And similarly to, as Karen was saying, we're running a project in 3 boroughs in London with very high BME populations, where we're really trying to think about this in relation to the projects that we're involved with, just to make sure that we're asking questions in ways that BME women, or it will relate, to their experiences in ways that it will make sense to them and their situations, and to really capture that in evaluation so we can start sharing some learning around this.
Thank you very much. And obviously there's a chance to follow up with all our panelists, because you'll get the contact details after the webinar as well. A short question, do you link with, for example, 5 adult protection? I presume that's some of the work you are doing, Jo?
Yeah, again, adult protection would generally be one of the representatives who we'd hope would be on a multi-agency violence against women partnership, in addition to child protection, community justice, community safety. Again, to recognise that this is an area where there's significant overlap between other duties. Sandra, did you want to come in?
I would just like to mention that just prior to Christmas, I was actually invited on to the National Financial Harm Working Group with the National Adult Protection Officer. So that's fantastic opportunity. I think the first meeting, I think I've been sent some papers, and I think the first meeting will actually be this week. So that's really good. So please keep in touch on that. Thank you.
I just wanted to say before we continue that we have run a bit over time now. We're a couple of minutes over, so thank you to all the people who have been able to sign in, and thank you for your patience with our sound issues here. We will continue this Q&A session now, so and we will pick up on some of it on the list. So we'll go on for another 7 minutes, 10 minutes maybe, if you have the time. We'll just see how it goes. For Karen, are the adult and child protection policies for your project available to share?
I'm happy to share.
Okay, so it's contact you when you
happy
can
to
get
share,
them. Yeah. There's another question for you, Karen. What shape did the financial capability work take in the project with Women West Lothians Women's Aid? Sorry, I'll try that again. What shape did the financial capability work take in the project with Women West Lothian Women's Aid? Has any capability resources been developed specifically for survivors? Do you think there's a further gap?
Yeah, that's probably a bit of a gap in relation to the actual tools, being domestic abuse specific, if that makes sense. We very much took it from the angle from the CAB in terms of the financial capability work that we do. Having said that, in the initial setup, we did involve a specialist worker in the development of some of the tools, but it probably was just a bit of a contribution as opposed to them being absolutely fit for the purpose. So yeah, that probably is a gap, but because of course there was an element of having to be really careful with these the clients that's engaged in the project, and and taking a bit of time. So the answer is no, because we took it very much from an advice point of view, but it's something that potentially we can look at developing with other similar projects and sharing that information.
Nicola had a comment. I don't know if it was this or the previous question, so I'll just open up for Nicola again. Nicola?
Yeah, so just to say that Surviving Economic Abuse has done a piece of work with Gen2, which is one of the big housing associations in the north of England. And we reviewed a generic financial capability curriculum from the perspective of how that could be delivered to those who support victims and survivors of financial abuse. I mentioned in my presentation that sometimes our generic practices can inadvertently not address the safety of survivors and victims. So I can double check with Gen 2, and if they're happy, I could share that report with you. And also to flag that the the New Zealand Australia Bank, I don't know if that's the right way around, or the Australian New Zealand Bank, I think it's Australian New Zealand Bank, ANZ, in Australia, have also published a piece of work around supporting the financial capability of domestic abuse survivors. So again, if anyone was interested in that, I could send it to them.
Thank you very much. We'll just power on with the last few questions. And if you have any more, Nicola, please feel free to give me a note, and I'll open your microphone again. Is there any data on the prevalence of economic abuse in Scotland, or is it all based on English and Welsh data? Also, is economic abuse recognized as a separate form of abuse for measurement in Scotland, or is it grouped into non-physical forms of abuse? I think, Joe, do you know any of these? And maybe it's open for Nicola as well again.
I don't really know. One of the pieces of work that we've been leading on is developing a performance framework, which started off with a scoping exercise looking at the data that people were collecting. And what I'd say is it highlighted significant gaps in data at a local and national level. And I don't remember if any of the scoping exercise we did of economic abuse being recorded in a consistent way. It was quite often recorded, particularly by referral partners. That was the main way that people were able to highlight it. But it seemed to me, at least, and this is probably different within different local areas who've done more intensive needs assessment and data collection, there isn't that robust a data set about economic abuse at the moment.
I'll open up for Nicola again. Nicola, do you have any information on this?
Yes, so when I came up for the event that Sandra ran in November, I did look at our data as I explained the work I did with Refuge and the Cooperative Bank, did look across the UK, so I tried to break it down. I should say that in addition to asking people a yes/no question around whether they'd experienced financial abuse, we also asked a number of questions, and if someone said yes in answer to that question, it indicated that they might have experienced financial abuse. So for respondents in Scotland, 4 out of 10 respondents indicated that they had experienced financial abuse through answering those questions. And just another piece of information I found out in relation to Scotland specifically was that 28% of all respondents also reported knowing someone who had experienced financial abuse.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there's a last question. Action on elder abuse. Do you work with this charity?
No.
No, there's no. Nicola, is that something you work, or do you work with action on the elder abuse?
Yeah, I should just mention that the Code of Conduct, which the UK Finance are looking to roll out, addresses both domestic abuse and elder abuse. And there's obviously very strong links between the two. I think sometimes that's helpful and unhelpful because the dynamics of those different forms of abuse can be quite different. But I think it's important that we do link the agendas up because there will be areas that we can learn from each other. But just also to flag that quite often what might be seen as elder financial abuse might be taking place within the context of an intimate relationship. And so we need to remember that we need to address that through domestic abuse frameworks and not just see it purely as elder abuse.
Thank you very much. That was the last of our questions. Nicola, thank you very much for dialing in, and we got it all to work, and we got some great questions. Sandra, do you want to round up here, or do you have anything to say at the end here, Nicola?
No, just again, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this webinar. It's been my first one, and I can say it's been a very positive experience, so thank you very much for that. And just to say to anyone who wants to contact me directly, please feel free to do so.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you for dialing in. I'll give the word to Sandra to round up here.
Okay, thanks very much everyone. Thank you for everyone listening today. Some of the information that Nicola shared there earlier can be found as well in her previous presentation slides from the stakeholder event that was held in November. So all this material is available on our website and we'll put more on it. Please get in touch with any of us after the event. I welcome if you can give us some more feedback in the survey questions that we'll send out also. And just thank you very much again for all our key speakers, and thank you very much, Christopher, for bearing with us and getting all the technology to work today. And thank you very much, everyone, for listening today. Thank you.
And I will